And once I started slowing down, I just felt like began noticing more, feeling more. It changed how I live, not just how I travel, but I began to establish more of a relationship with my kids. I started listening to them, not listening to respond, but just actually listening to them to just listen and understand, right? If things were much more in slower motion, I just began to appreciate the little things that are around me. I'm a lot more patient when I pause and I stop rushing.
Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast, everybody. Today we are talking with a father who put his career in limbo to travel the world with his wife and their 2 daughters. We have author Charles Achampong on the podcast, here to discuss how to take that leap into travel, as well as his new book, Around the World in Family Days. Hi, Charles. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard, very much for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here. And I got to tell you, your book was really inspirational to push. I'm a father as well, to push and do these trips as a family. And there's lots of great messages in the book. But before we get to that, I wonder if you can maybe share your background and how travel's played a role in your life to date.
Yeah. Sure. No, I'm more than happy to. So I'm a speaker, a writer, someone who's lived, I would say, in constant motion, always chasing whatever the next milestone is. And I spent the last 20 years or so in a variety of different leadership fields in the public, private, not-for-profit, philanthropic sectors, all sort of purpose-driven, but eventually running on empty. And last year, 2024, my wife and I, we hit pause. We took our 2 daughters, 11 and 8, on a global sabbatical, and not to really escape, but just to reconnect with one another. So 8 countries, 4 continents, and just the realization that pausing wasn't really a break from ambition, as many people like to think of it, but more of a strategy in sustaining it. And now, I was very fortunate to have read sort of put together a book, Around the World in Family Days, not a checklist of places, but more a deeper reflection for me to focus on the things that really matter. And so I've kind of now focused more on sort of teaching ambitious professionals how to build powerful pauses into their lives so they can stop running on empty and start living more fully. And I think really the genesis of my sort of journey, even before all this, was really the influence of my parents and the importance of travel and being able to use it as a classroom. And I think partly because of the fact that a lot of my extended family members were in Ghana in West Africa, that necessitated us to kind of travel more often from home in Canada to Ghana to see my grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles and extended family members. So it's something that's been part and parcel of my life for as long as I can remember.
And why was travel important for you as a parent? You talked about wanting to put pause on this hectic lifestyle. Why not take a sabbatical and just chill out in Toronto? Why explore the world? And what was important for you as a parent to do that with your children?
Yeah, for me, travel is the ultimate classroom. It's a mirror, right? I wanted my daughters to learn that the world is much bigger than our neighborhood here in Toronto, their school, or even Canada, as great of a country it is. And so I think that when you see how others live, you start to ask better questions. You listen more intensely, more deeply, and you realize that your way isn't really the only way. And for me, that's huge for any kid, and particularly my kids, right? And honestly, for us as adults too. And so it was less about sightseeing and seeing all of the different attractions and more about being able to help them see themselves and others with a bit more empathy and awareness, and realizing that there's a big, broad world out there.
Yeah, I just think that's so important. If you never go see how different life is and how hard life can be for a lot of people, you don't realize how lucky you are for what you have. But a lot of people struggle. And you mentioned, your life's hectic. Your wife and yourself are accomplished professionals. You've got a stable, great life in Toronto. Can you talk about just how it felt like when you finally started booking tickets? And was it stressful to give up that stable career, that stable life? And was there something that helped you make that first step?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, great question. I mean, it was a mix of excitement, enthusiasm, and second guessing. Honestly, it didn't really feel real until we were on the plane. And even then, it took us a couple months for us to realize, wow, this is what our new normal looks like. But I'd say that leading up to that, it was like a swirl of like, what ifs? Should we be doing this? Should we really be spending all this money? What happens if we don't have our jobs when we come back? Will our house still be standing? What will people think? There's this kind of strange vulnerability, I think, that comes with actually going after something that you've been planning for a very long time. Like for us, this was our 10-year goal, 10-year dream, right? It was both terrifying and thrilling. And yet, I think once we committed, things began to align and come into place in terms of, better than we could have ever planned or envisioned. So it was exciting, enthralling, but really it was not until we actually started living life according to our new normal while we were traveling that it became more real for us.
Now, I know a lot of people, they're scared of taking an extended break, and it almost always comes down to work.
Hmm.
And do you want to talk about how you navigated that? Work is a big part of lots of people's identities. And then, you have colleagues that you care about. You have projects that are important to you personally. There's the salary aspect. How did you navigate all of that? Because that's the number one thing I always hear from people that kind of scares them about doing these extended trips.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done, leaving something that was so secure, especially when you've worked hard for it, all your life. It doesn't come easy. I've had such an amazing career of such variety of different, types of jobs, positions of authority, environments, different sectors. But I think over time, I just realized that I was craving something more than a promotion or another successful project. I wanted to be a bit more present, more aware of my surroundings. I wanted memories with my family because I know there's going to be a point at some time when my girls are going to want to spend more time with their friends or significant others than they do with their parents, right? And to me, I, I just had more time to kind of redefine what success looked like. It wasn't necessarily about climbing higher, but really kind of slowing down to enjoy what I already had. And for me, that shift, it changed everything. It changed, my approach to my relationship with my spouse, with my kids, all that. So the career piece, yes, it is definitely hard to give up, knowing that it was going to be hard to re-enter what that would look like. But I feel fortunate enough that I've established enough of variety in my career that if I wanted to return back to whatever that looked like before I left, that I would be able to do so, even if I had to take a step back. So I didn't want that to be something that was going to inhibit me. And also I had, this is a 10-year goal that we put in mind. So it's not like we got up and decided to go the next day and leave everything behind. It's something that I've been able to think about and mull it over time. And my thought process has evolved over time in terms of, focusing on a stable career and one where there's a bit more dynamic and fluidity to it.
And, a lot of people, they go for a 1 week or a 2 week holiday every year.
Mm.
You chose to go much longer. What was the driving force of not just trying to do a bunch of, 3 week or 4 week trips that maybe you can fit into your career or fit into your life? What were you hoping to achieve by this long period on the
Yeah, I
road,
mean,
so to
so
speak?
one of the things we tried to do is that we didn't want to. This is a 10-year goal to be able to take our kids on a trip around the world, 8 countries, 4 continents, just under a year. And for us, we wanted to make sure that we lived a life that was authentic to us. So we prioritized, like many people do, experiences over things. And so we didn't spend our money on things. We spent our money on experiences. So while we knew that we were planning towards this goal of having a 10-year or a trip around the world in 10 years, we still were able to travel over the course of that decade, right? We still found, I think about the fact that my oldest daughter took her initial first steps in Istanbul, or my youngest daughter, haggling in, the markets in Jordan and in Amman, Jordan. Like all these things are things that have really shaped them. So, in terms of our decision of still continuing to keep the status quo, still finding opportunities for us to enjoy our experiences and enjoying the world over the decade in terms of taking vacations and trips and travel, but knowing that our focus was on experiences, on spending time with the kids, and on seeing places that we wanted to expose them to, and still being able to pursue this opportunity of really pursuing a trip around the world. Yeah.
And then how did you decide where to go? I know there's, some people just they start and they don't plan anything and they kind of the trip takes them wherever. Other people have a million places they want to go. And,
Yeah.
how did you find the balance of where to go and how long to spend in each place?
Yeah, Richard. I mean, I admire the people who are in the former, who are able to be a bit more laissez-faire or a bit more open-ended. But and maybe that'd be my kind of category. But they've never met my wife, Janice, who is a serial event planner. Stuff is like in her blood. It's in her DNA, And so we kept it pretty simple. We wanted warm weather, places we hadn't been to, countries we knew people in. I mean, really, we only had carry-ons and backpacks that we were sort of taking with us. Each individual, so myself, spouse, and two girls, we each had a carry-on in a backpack. And packing light was key, right? We wanted to follow the sun. So we had a chance to revisit some of the places that we traveled to before we had kids. And this time we got to experience them through our daughter's eyes, right? So that was kind of cool. And some spots were chosen because they were affordable, others because they allowed us to reconnect with family. The goal wasn't to try and see the whole world. It was just enough for us to feel stretched, grounded, enthralled, inspired, right? So I think that was the overall goal. So it was a mixture of those pieces in terms of criteria of places that we hadn't been to, places that we wanted to revisit with the kids, warmer destinations, and seeing places that had family members that we hadn't seen in some time, or even former colleagues that we had worked with some time ago that we wanted to reconnect with this time around.
Another barrier when people start thinking of these big journeys is cost. And your book has quite a few cost saving strategies, one of which I think is just so obvious, but I never thought about it. I'll see if you share that one, because that's one that resonated with me. But can you maybe share a few of the major cost savings that can take this trip from unaffordable to doable?
Yeah, and so for us, it was definitely loyalty points. I've traveled a lot for work before our trip, and so we had a ton of loyalty points that we could finally use. And because this was a 10-year plan, we were able to accumulate quite a few loyalty points and cover a significant amount of our travel, particularly our airfare, as a result of that. And so and then just before we left, a neighbor down the street needed a place to stay while doing renovations, and renting out our home during the exact window. It was a total fluke, but in the best way. Like we were so reluctant to even, we were kind of going back and forth as to whether we wanted to leave the house empty, have friends and family come in and check on our place. But we said, you know what, let's throw caution to the wind and put up a for lease sign. And literally 24 hours later, a neighbor that we hadn't met that was down the street from us came and knocked on our door and said that this is the exact period that we needed to rent your place at. And so they did a quick 30-second look and they rented their place. So that helped. I mean, we kept our costs low by cooking our own meals, using local transit, staying longer in each place to avoid constant travel expenses. It wasn't fancy, but it worked out beautifully. And I mean, the other piece is that we don't have a car. So we rely on walking and taking public transit everywhere. So that's something that's been able to save us significantly a lot. And I think as well, the pandemic, while it provided a lot of sadness and challenge for all of us, it also meant that because we were both working full time at the time and working remotely, work from home, we weren't spending the same amount of money that we would typically spend. So there was a significant amount of savings that were generated as a result of the pandemic too. And I think, I'd be naive in saying if their luck didn't play a role in terms of traveling for work and having the career that allowed me to do that, in terms of renting out our home to a family of 3 that became 5. They had twins recently, right, that were looking after our place, and things just really worked out. When you put stuff into the universe, it's amazing how magically they manifest and become reality.
Yeah, the one that resonated with me was the renting out your house to a neighbor. And
Yes.
you're always reluctant. You're going to rent your house out. Am I going to come back and the house will be trashed?
Yes.
And I said to my wife, I'm like, on our little community Facebook group, like at least once a month, probably more like 2 or 3 times a month, people are saying, I'm doing a rent out. Is anyone renting a home for 4 months, for 6 months? And it's like, oh yeah, I'd totally rent to a neighbor, because I know that they're not, they're going to leave when they say they're going to leave. They're a homeowner. They're going to understand. I'm not going to come back with things being destroyed.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, this is a huge, like, the rent is going to pay for a lot of the accommodation costs if you're going to a lower, and all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, the trip just got a lot easier if your accommodations are covered. Okay, well, if you use points for your flights and that's covered, then it's like, it's kind of just operating costs, which, Here in Canada, there's a lot of countries that are more expensive, but there's also a lot of countries that are cheaper. So it's like, actually, we might be able to save some money just, if you look at it, because
Hang
all we're
on.
paying for is food and doing fun stuff, which is a lot less than, Airbnbs, hotels, flights, all those things.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, that was such a saving grace in terms of being able to rent another place. And the fact that, I mean, they took such great care of the place and knowing that someone who literally lives a 2-minute walk down the street from you, and it helped them because of the fact that they were able to walk in and check in on the progress of their renovation, but they left the place in immaculate condition. It was just, it was very much a blessing in disguise in terms of having someone who could alleviate the costs, which is a huge benefit because this is revenue or income that we had never really kind of planned for. So that was an added bonus. And then the fact that they're able to look after your place while you're traveling and give you updates to let you know how things are going, and it's a member of your community as well. So that went a long way.
Another question that people always ask is about schooling. They have kids in
Yeah.
school. You're away for a year. How did you handle that?
Yeah. It's honestly, we got lucky because of COVID, their entire curriculum was already available online. And so the teachers were incredibly supportive, right? They even had the girls send postcards from every country, and their class followed along on the map that they'd blown up in the classroom that they were able to follow along on. It turned into this, I think, for them, a beautiful global learning experience. And I mean, outside of the academics, they learned things no classroom could have ever taught them, right? My mother-in-law is a former educator. And so she created these books for the girls that talked about everything from, currency conversion to, navigating being a new kid again and again and again in each place, reading subway maps, what the type of, the type of sort of political system that they had in the particular country, the capital, who the head of state was. It was all these things that required them to, of course they could have done the research, but we were very adamant about making sure that they were able to engage with the locals in each place we spoke to or traveled to, so they could speak to them and get a sense of what they were learning about as well. And then, of course, you complement that with the museums and all of the other sort of hands-on experiential activities. So we were lucky in the fact that I think, before COVID, it may have been a bit of a challenge, but after the COVID, focusing on reading, writing, and arithmetic was something that we could do. I mean, it wasn't all rainbows and unicorns. It was a bit of a COVID-19 PTSD situation, having the kids being taught by their mom and dad, right? Especially because they're in French immersion. And my French is, as much as I grew up in Ottawa, is still average at best. And my spouse, who grew up in Saskatchewan, learned French through audio tapes, right? So I don't pronounce things as accurately as I should, and a bit of a back and forth in terms of learning things in French. But overall, they did well. I thought there'd be a bit of a lag in terms of their reentry back into school this past September, but they're thriving. It's amazing how a bit of a change of routine changes their perspective around school. If anything, the challenge was them just kind of returning back to not the routine, but being in a desk and listening to the individual at the front of the classroom and kind of walking through and talking through the lesson and instruction. So that was a bit of an adjustment, but no, they're doing really well.
One of the things you mentioned in your book is that you noticed lots of changes, one of which was this like rushing aspect that's really present
Mm.
in our lives, especially with kids. You're rushing to swimming or friend's house. You're like, it's always rushing. Can you talk a little bit more about how this impacted you, this feeling of like, stop rushing? Because some people, when they travel, like my parents,
Yeah.
they hit it so hard that they're almost 80. And as kids, we can't keep up with them because they rush even harder on their traveling. But like, how did this stop rushing? How did it manifest for you on your trip?
Uh, this was a big shift. My spouse and I are naturally doers. I love lists. I love crossing things off lists. I love keeping things moving. But it honestly took about 2 months before I could really truly slow down. I'm on one end of the continuum and then moving to the other side of the continuum and figuring out what my happy medium was. Like I remember one day in Thailand, gorgeous weather. We spent the whole day inside playing board games, reading, napping, and I didn't feel guilty about it, right? That was the breakthrough. Anytime it was a nice day outside, I always kind of like, okay, we need to go somewhere, we need to do something, we need to take advantage of where we are. It just really kind of taught me that rest isn't something that you earn, it's something that you need, right? And once I started slowing down, I just felt like began noticing more, feeling more. It changed how I live, not just how I travel, but I began to establish more of a relationship with my kids. I started listening to them, not listening to respond, but just actually listening to them to just listen and understand, right? So, and even my spouse too. I felt that things were much more in slower motion. I just began to appreciate the little things that are around me. I'd love going for a walk and not listening to a podcast and just being present, taking in the sounds that are around me, the smells, being able to pause and notice, and then reset and try and repeat and try and create that as part of my formula, right? So it was a very hard thing to do, and even since returning. Now that I talk a lot about this power of pausing and the fact that you don't need a passport to pause, right? Or you don't need permission to pause. Or you don't need to be productive to pause, right? So that's kind of my focus from that perspective when I speak to groups. But I just try and find the everyday pauses at a red light, at a stop sign, when I'm grabbing my coffee, and just be still and notice what's going on around me. So it's something I've definitely evolved into becoming and doing, but I find that I'm a lot more patient when I pause and I stop rushing. Trust me that it's hard because you become a product of your environment. So it becomes easy to sort of return back to your previous life and iteration. But I'm a lot more present as a result of pausing and not rushing as much.
I think that's just like such a great part of travel. And you're right.
Mm,
You come back and then a month later, you're like, oh, I'm back to that stressed
exactly.
out person and I'm rushing around. It's like, oh, I gotta get back to that, like just mellow and just enjoy doing nothing. Um,
Exactly.
One thing that seemed really spectacular was taking your family back to Ghana to see where your parents grew up. Can you talk about how impactful that was for your kids and even for you to kind of see this place, this part of your parents' life that it seemed like you didn't fully know about that as, going back, you didn't know like all these details of their childhood lives.
Yeah, so both my parents are from Ghana. Grew up in Ghana and eventually moved to Canada at different times in the 60s and 70s. So they've been in Canada for, let's see, longer than they were alive and spent, or longer than the time that they spent in Ghana. But we had a chance just prior to the pandemic to take my girls and my spouse. We went back to Ghana. My dad wasn't there at the time. But this time around last year, we were able to do a visit with both my parents, my mom and dad, and my siblings, and my girls, and my spouse, like all of us all under one roof with like, it almost felt like a bit of a reality TV show, but it was honestly the most meaningful part of the trip. Being there with my parents, siblings, and daughters, it just made everything feel much more real in a different way. And it wasn't just telling my girls about their roots. I was showing them, like letting them hear the stories straight from their grandparents, being able to walk the path my dad took to go to school, hearing about all the mischievous things my dad got into, being able to jump onto the train and not paying, and being reprimanded by his teacher for not behaving, or for them to hear stories of my aunt, my dad's sister, about what it was for him to be like the oldest sibling, and and how he was towards his siblings, right? And even to be able to see my mom's side of the family, she's the second youngest of 11 kids, right? And to be able to see all of their extended aunts and uncles and cousins, I don't know, it just gave me a much deeper sense or a deeper pride in where they came from. That kind of experience and standing where your ancestors stood, you can't replicate that in a textbook or from a family tree website, right? So being able to have that lived experience, I think, and the fact that they now are much more conversant and cognizant of Ghana and their relatives, and now that they're much older and are more likely to remember their engagement there, I think it goes a long way. And also because these moments are fleeting. My parents are now in their late 70s, 80s. And so I know that these opportunities are few and far between. So I really tried to be, again, paused and be in the moment. And I had gone in with this, I want to do this, take this, we got to do family pictures and all that. But it was just so nice just to kind of relax and chill and sit outside, enjoy the breeze and the warm air, and watching my daughter, youngest one, play chess with my dad, right? Or to see my oldest Cassia gossip or chats with the other old ladies and my mom about what's going on in the neighborhood. I love that stuff. Again, these are things that I'm just kind of like, oh, I hope you remember these experiences because I know I will. So that was one of the highlights and beautiful experiences of our trip.
From a highlights like that, there's also challenges, and you talk about the
Yeah.
inequality that pervades. Coming from Canada, I didn't realize we're a fairly equal society compared to lots of places. When you travel, you just see this inequality, and you talk most
Mm.
vividly in South Africa. Can
Mm.
you talk about how you talked about these challenging issues with your children? Because they're still, fairly young. You're not out there with, fully developed teenagers. These are some tough discussions.
Yeah, it wasn't I mean there's no country that's perfect, but I think the fact that they were observant enough to see the inequalities what I think stood out to me. It wasn't an easy conversation, but I think it was an important one, right? I reminded them that inequality exists everywhere. But in South Africa, it was much more visible along racial lines. I think it's something that they hadn't been accustomed to seeing in their own experience. And you can't ignore that, right? Because my wife is white. I'm black. Our daughters have grown up seeing both sides of their family, right? But here the history hit, a bit more differently. They read about apartheid, but seeing its effects firsthand really shook them. And being able to hear the stories, we did a tour, a food tour through uh, Cape Town, and just to hear the stories of the food tour guide leader. It was a very private tour, great experience. And not only did we do food, but we also spent time in the communities, hearing their own lived experience and stories of Nelson Mandela, of the things that they had gone through. The thing that really stood out to, especially my oldest daughter, was this pencil test. This idea of being able to determine if it seemed like it wasn't obvious what your authenticity, or rather what your ethnicity was, they would put a pencil in your hair, and if the pencil stayed firm in your hair, you were deemed to be black. But if the pencil moved ever so slightly or fell out of your hair, you were considered to be colored, someone of mixed race, right? So that simple pencil test, that could determine, where you lived, who you could love, and what dreams you could aspire to. And so I think that was mind blowing for the girls. And to have that pencil go into my daughter's hair, and the fact that my two daughters, very different in terms of the texture of their hair, which seems, like, okay, whatever. But the fact that they would have been treated differently, one would have been considered to be black and had a particular trajectory in life, and another would have been considered to be colored because her hair was much more fine or thin, right? So I still wrestle with how much of the world's brokenness to show them, right? But I try and meet their questions with honesty without overwhelming them because I don't know. There's no perfect script on how to do that, and I struggle with even how to do that, maintaining that sense of innocence and also ensuring that they're not walking around with their head in the sand.
It's just incredible. You just look at a way to get educated and learn
Mm,
is talking to different people, hearing about history,
mm,
understanding it, and then applying it. And there's no better way than the experiences you just shared.
hmm
You have a great quote from your time in Albania. I think it was an old guy who said this to you. Your old life doesn't get to decide your new life story.
yeah.
And I'm still wrestling with what exactly, how does that apply to me? But it seemed like there was something so deep. How did that impact you now that your trip is over?
Yeah, that quote came from a real moment of frustration, I think. We were so I had met, and take a step back. We had met rather retired gentleman from Albania who had, he had his life ahead of him, and it was a communist country. Very interesting insight in history in the country of Albania, and it was closed for such a long period of time. And he was a tradesperson, and so plumber, if I remember, a carpenter, or something along those lines. And his dad was just foreseeing the world was opening up. The Berlin Wall had come down. The countries were opening up in Europe, and they were creating a new governance structure, a new foreign service, diplomats, et cetera, et cetera. And so this gentleman's dad had said to him, you need to look about how you can take advantage and move away from what you've been doing in the past, and really sort of broaden and open up your perspective to new horizons. And he transitioned from being a carpenter to one of the first diplomats, Albania represented, one of the first diplomats from Albania representing in the EU, right? And so For me, I think that, in many ways, again, that quote came from a moment of frustration, just more from the perspective of we were tired, we were off plan. I caught myself in many ways kind of in the past measuring our success by our old standards, productivity, checklists, getting things done right, quote unquote, right? And then, I don't know, it hit me, why was I dragging old expectations into this new chapter after we returned back from our trip? And I mean, that line reminds me, I mean, for those people who are listening, that your past doesn't get to determine your final word, right? I mean, you can choose a new direction, even if it feels messy and uncertain. I know how hard it is when people want to know what the outcome is going to be, right? But I think we are all, in many ways, the producers, directors, authors of our own life, and you get to decide what that next line is going to be, not your old fears, which I think and I know is easier said than done. But I see how my new life trajectory has gone compared to my old life trajectory, and I think what I feel so this fire in my belly because I'm creating it myself for me and I'm not doing it for someone else. So it's a powerful line in the quote, and it's one that I'll remember because I mean, yeah, you get to decide what your life is, not, your old life doesn't get to influence that. So yeah.
I'm interested. You did this great trip and then you decided to write a book. What was the driving force to capture all this in a book?
Yeah, truthfully, I did not want to write a book at all. I had no interest in becoming an author. I wasn't looking to be an author. It was not something that was on my bucket list. But I think when I would write blog updates and I just realized how much I enjoyed writing and how therapeutic it was, right? And then when we came back, these stories I think were, I don't know, alive inside of me, for a better way of saying it. And I wanted a way to hold on to them, to create a legacy for the kids, to, as a way for them to remember the trip, and it helped me process the journey in many ways. It gave me a way to kind of leave something lasting for the girls and my spouse. And then a childhood friend had reached out to me, along the way and said, "Hey, you need to, your writing is enjoyable. You need to be able to put this into a book." And I kind of hemmed and hawed and realized I'm like, okay, well, if I'm not returning back to my previous employer, and as I look for new work, let this pet project, I could do it on the side of my desk. But as time went on, I just enjoyed the experience and it became much real, right? And it almost became like a love letter to curiosity, to courage, to connection. It's my quote unquote pause in print. And it's my invitation for others to kind of find their own pause as well through the book. And it was just an enjoyable experience. When I get up and I look at the book in the morning, it's on my nightstand, and I think, wow, I can't believe that I wrote this. It took me 5 to 6 months and I treated it like a full-time job. I would have probably taken much longer, but I just love the fact that I was able to, capture our experience in a book for others to read and experience. And it was just an enjoyable adventure. Yeah.
And yeah, it's a great read. As someone who wasn't on there and doesn't know you, it was a fun read just to kind of see the impact of travel, how you folks planned and did this trip, and then kind of the life lessons that came out of it.
Thank
I saw
you.
somewhere, I think it was in maybe your newsletter, that you had a friend that read your book that you hadn't been in touch with, and the friend's like, "This changed my life." Can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit more about that? Because I think the big thing with books is like, yeah, it's great as a memento, but if it also affects change, that must be so powerful.
Honestly, so thank you. I enjoyed writing the book, and honestly, I underestimated how impactful words were going to be. Maybe that's not the right way of saying it, but maybe how impactful my own words were going to be. Like, this was just our story, so I never expected it to actually have the impact that it was going to do. But I received a note from a friend who said, I didn't realize this is very successful career-wise. He's done really well for himself, but he sent me a note saying, "I didn't realize I was living my life by default instead of design." And I was kind of like, whoa. That hit me hard. As a result of reading your book, that's what I felt. Like, he didn't need a plane ticket or passport. For him, he said he just needed permission to rethink the pace and priorities of his life. And that's, to me, the real point, right? You don't need to travel 10,000 miles to find yourself. Like, I get it. I found my pause through travel, but sometimes the boldest trip that you take can be one where you go from autopilot to awareness, right? And the only thing you really have to do is kind of a willingness to be open to whatever it is that the universe brings your way, and just keep an open mind that way. So that really, that when I saw that note from them, I'm like, wow, this is a person who I, thought from what you see online through social media and in conversations with them that they had everything. And so to see them say that, I was like, whoa, okay, maybe there's more to this than I realized. So very impactful, very, very reaffirming for me as someone who's kind of sharing their thoughts and their experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've talked to lots of people kind of similar to this, where doing the default or keep doing what you're doing is a choice. And people kind of don't realize, hang on, I can actually choose to do something different. And, you know,
Yes.
taking a year off is a lot of work to do it, but it is totally doable if that is something that's meaningful for you. And I think, as you say, that's the first decision. It's almost your old life doesn't get to decide your new life story
Yes.
unless you choose to, and the old life might be great, but there's that aspect of choice, which, your friend, identified reading your book. Um,
Hmm.
you've talked a lot about growth and change as an outcome of this trip, kind of tangible aspects, but are there other aspects to your family? Like, do you feel your family is different now than it was before the trip? And if so, how?
150%. I think each of us in our own way has done a 180-degree turn. We live much more of a slower life now. I think we laugh a lot more. At least my girls laugh a lot more at my really bad dad jokes. We I feel like we linger more after dinner. Usually we eat dinner and then everyone goes their separate ways to do their thing. But now we kind of chat and enjoy each other's company a bit more. I would have thought that all that time together would have driven us crazy, which at moments, of course, it did, because I don't want to paint this as being all rainbows and unicorns like everything else. We had our challenges, right? But I see the change in each of my girls. My oldest, who is much more observant and quiet, much more of an introvert, more academic in nature. She is much more. She's more willing to try things, right? I've talked about the fact that this trip has really improved my family's the term I use is failure immunity. Not necessarily being immune to failure, but being immune to the feeling that failure has on you. And I've seen that in spades with her. She's the type of person in the past that only really wanted to try something if she knew that she was going to be successful. I mean, we're all like that, right? But the fact is that she's so much more open to just trying things. She's just gotten involved in so many different activities at school, extracurricular sports, all these things that are things that she's put her hand up for to do. So I love that. I think of my youngest and the fact that, she's much more of the extrovert of the family spokesperson, as we always call her, right? But she's much more thoughtful, and she asks much better questions. She's not much more introspective, which I'm so surprised. Like she's gone I've tried to ensure that we kind of, at the end of the day, it's not so much like, how was your day? Like, let me ask you a bit, something a bit more, sort of more in depth around like what surprised you today or what were you grateful for, right? So there's a bit less rushing and less striving and more noticing. Even in myself, I am far more patient, more content. I'm living my much more of an authentic life, I feel, right? In terms of what I should be doing and what I want to be doing as well. I think about my spouse, who is always been so patient with everyone in the family and just so open to things, but her interest in wanting to be able to think about what do we do next, like how do we continue to keep this going, not only at home but thinking about future trips and travel as well. So that's something that we're all excited about. I think the biggest change wasn't necessarily the miles that we traveled, it was more the way that how we move through everyday life now, right? More intentional, more present, and more connected without being too heavily influenced by our own environment. So yeah.
So if there are people listening and they have something they want to do, there's a trip. It could be a 2-week trip. It could be a year-long trip. It could be anything. What's the first step you'd recommend they take to kind of make this a reality?
Yeah, just start. Start messy, start scared, but just start, right? Take a tiny, minuscule baby step in the direction, right? You look at people's blogs, feel free to check out my website of our experience. Like, I think you just need, rather than just talk about it at the 50,000 foot level view, do something that moves you in that direction, right? And there's no perfect moment coming. People often ask me, you guys waited until, your kids were of this age? I'm like, no, we said we were going to go in 10 years. And so whatever the situation was whatever the situation was. We were planning on going, save what you can, plan what you can, but don't let the fear keep you from waiting, right? There's no perfect moment. And so I think for us, it was the fact that the magic is in saying yes before you're really ready, right? And for us, the point wasn't to come back with impressive photos. It was to come back a little bit more, aware, awake, alive than, we left. So just make that baby step forward and just, start in any way, shape, or form. I think that's my advice to people who are looking to sort of plan their dream trip.
Charles, that's a beautiful way to end this show. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to share all this wisdom and advice.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. This has been really fun. I always enjoy these. It gives me an opportunity to relive all of the exciting moments that we had, and it gives me a chance to reflect as well. So thank you very much for sharing our story. Much appreciated, Richard.
My pleasure. If people want to connect with you, learn more, find your book, how can they do that?
Yeah, so they can find my book on Amazon, Around the World in Family Days, What We Left When We Learned It All Behind to Travel the Globe. And you can also connect with me on Instagram at Around the World in Family Days. You can check out my LinkedIn page, Charles Achampong, as well. And also my website, charlesachampong.com, where you can get information about me and the book, and even want to engage me more from a speaking perspective. I'd love to be able to keep the conversation going. So those are the ways to get in touch with me.
That's great. And I'll put links to all of those in the show notes. And with that, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. If you like this, please give us a like or a comment on whatever podcast player you're using. And with that, we'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Bye-bye. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.